I'm thrilled that you're here. You're in for quite a treat with Trish Smith presenting her presentation on Drayton Hall's iconic portico, both its history and all of the recent work that's gone into it. Before introducing Trish, though, I want to remind you of a few details. First, if you could join me in silencing your cell phones. Second, if you need to use the lavatory, the women's is located at the landing just behind me, and the men's on the first floor back in this direction. Lastly, we'd like to thank the friends of Drayton Hall that make this type of event possible. If you are not an active member in the Friends of Drayton Hall, I'd encourage you to join, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer those later this evening. Contributions that come to Drayton Hall through the Friends of Drayton Hall sustain our operations and also facilitate our view to the future, which you'll be hearing about in subsequent months. Now, Trish Smith, who is going to take the stage in just a minute. Trish is the curator of historic architectural resources at Drayton Hall, and after graduating with a BA in art history from the University of South Carolina Honors College, Smith received her MS from the Clemson University and College of Charleston Joint Graduate Program in Historic Preservation. Smith came to Drayton Hall in 2010 as a Wood Family Fellow, just like myself and our colleague Sarah Stroud Clark. And as a Wood Family Fellow, she completed important work establishing a preservation archive and documenting Drayton Hall. She joined the Drayton Hall staff permanently upon the completion of her fellowship, and in 2013, she was awarded a residential fellowship at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation's Digital History Center to begin study of Drayton Hall and the digital application of 3D visualization technology for the documentation and interpretation of Drayton Hall. During her tenure at Drayton Hall, she's assembled the site's first preservation archive, as mentioned earlier, carried out several architectural conservation projects, launched the digital restoration of Drayton Hall, and is currently managing the rehabilitation of Drayton Hall's iconic portico, which is almost finished. So close, and you're going to hear more about that this evening. So join me in welcoming Trish Smith.
Thank you, Carter, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here tonight. It's such a privilege for me to have this opportunity to speak to you all about this project that we embarked upon 5 years ago. So many people have devoted so much of their time to the rehabilitation of Drayton Hall's portico. I wish I had time to call everyone by name, but I do want to recognize all the folks who are named here. All of these people had a hand in this project and are deserving of much thanks. I would also like to acknowledge several donors who made leadership gifts to the Portico Rehabilitation Project. Special thanks to Robert and Pat Prelo, the Butler Foundation, the French Heritage Society, and several anonymous individual donors for their generous contributions. And thank you to the Friends of Drayton Hall. Your membership dollars help pay for critical priorities such as this one. On the 24th day of February, 1802, Charles Drayton made an entry in his diary noting that he had begun to rout the bees from their lodgment in the cornice of the lower portico. All that remains of said cornice today is this fascia board that still retains its first coat of yellow ochre paint from the 18th century. When we look to the documentary record to learn what interventions the Draytons undertook to maintain or repair the portico, the story begins here with this tiny winged foe. It may strike you as a rather pedestrian undertaking, shooing bees from such a grand edifice, but bees are capable of wreaking havoc on a building, and such an undertaking may have been Charles's first indication that bigger projects were on the horizon. In 1811, he noted that a German carpenter came to Drayton Hall to survey the portico and other decays. 4 years later, in the spring of 1815, several entries in Charles's diary chronicled the removal of a stone pillar in jeopardy, and 3 years after that, the erection of an architrave upon the columns. For the better part of a decade, it seems, major modifications were being made to the portico. We can see evidence of these and other changes in various pockets and cavities in and around the portico, evidence that we spent more than a year gathering and examining. But let's step back for a moment and consider how we came to be poking around in said cavities, and furthermore, why we should all be gathered here tonight, learning about our extensive efforts to preserve what one might be forgiven for thinking of as a really nice porch. An exterior pedimented structure sheltering an entrance and supported by columns. That's what a portico essentially is. And before the mid-18th century, most people were content to call such a structure a porch. But the burgeoning taste for neoclassical architecture revived its associated terminology, and thus the porch became the portico. At Drayton Hall, we make the bold assertion that our portico is the best. Dr. Ed Chappell, the Director of Architectural and Archaeological Research at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, very succinctly explains why. He says, because of its scale and integration with the recessed center of the house, it is the best Palladian portico surviving from early America. The Palladian style to which Dr. Chappell refers is the neoclassical architecture that sprang from the work of 16th century Italian architect Andrea Palladio, whose careful interpretations of classical Greek and Roman architecture spread to England in the 17th century, and from there to the American colonies. It is important to consider the intermediate influence of the Anglo-Palladians and the rather conspicuous absence of their influence on the design of the portico at Drayton Hall. You see, the English Palladians had a habit of building porticos with monumental columns, that is, columns that stretched the full height of a structure, as seen here at Houghton Hall. The double portico featured prominently in Palladio's designs for several Italian villas, but was never adopted by the English Palladians. This is important because it tells us something about the person who designed Drayton Hall, presumably John Drayton himself. We can infer that John had a sufficiently sophisticated grasp of Palladian architecture to draw inspiration from the source, rather than engaging in architectural mimesis of his English contemporaries. Now that we've established what a portico is and why ours is the best, let's get to the nuts and bolts of the project. Just let that sink in for a moment. Before we begin dissecting this portico project, allow me to introduce some nomenclature that will hopefully help you keep your bearings as we navigate among the columns, piers, and floors. If you're standing on the mound in front of the house, sight north is in the direction of the parking lot. The river side of the house is east, and the portico side is west. The ground floor we call the basement. The main floor of the house, or piano nobile, we simply refer to as the first floor. And above that are the second floor and the attic. With regard to the columns, we were primarily concerned with those on the first floor, and counting from north to south, or left to right, we called those columns 1, 2, 3, and 4. Below columns 1 and 4 are brick supports that I'll call pillars, not to be confused with brick piers that support the arches in the basement. In August 2011, engineers from 5 respected engineering firms gathered at Drayton Hall for a pre-bid conference where staff presented them with our observations and concerns regarding the structural integrity of the portico. The first issue raised was also the most readily apparent portico decay, the rust jacking and concrete spalling that was steadily eroding the 5 concrete beams in the basement. In these photographs, you can see that previous attempts were made to halt the corrosion and repair the spalled concrete, but the structural assessment would soon reveal that such repairs failed to address the root cause of the problem, water infiltration, and thus were destined to fail. At the time of the pre-bid conference, we were aware that moisture intrusion had damaged wooden underlayment and joists on the second floor. In 2009, these water-damaged areas were repaired, and plastic sheeting was put down on the second floor as a temporary measure to halt the water infiltration. But engineers were instructed to consider this issue within the scope of the project. Many a photo in front of the house has captured evidence of another structural concern that we've presented to the assembled group of engineers. Look at the area between the door and adjacent window on the first floor, and you can clearly see that they slope down toward one another. Finally, we pointed out the roughly 60,000 visitors that were coming to Drayton Hall each year. What impact did they have on the structure, if any? And were we doing everything in our power to ensure they would be safe as they toured the house? These were the chief concerns that we presented to the assembled group. A month later, a contract was awarded to Craig Bennett at 4SE, now of Bennett Preservation Engineering, for the structural assessment of Drayton Hall's portico. Bennett's team immediately began a thorough assessment of the portico, and on June 1st, 2012, they presented a report detailing their findings. Many of the observations made in the report were made possible by the work of Drayton Hall's archaeologist and curator of collections, Sarah Stroud Clark. Sarah excavated 3 units in the basement below the portico and 1 additional unit on the exterior of the portico, adjacent to a brick pillar, to expose the foundations that support the portico. This pier is one of 2 which supports the front wall of the house. It is the same one that we were concerned about going into the assessment due to the visible sag in the masonry above. Sarah's excavations around the pier revealed that brick continues down for 7 courses, or about 18 inches, below the finished floor, and steps out a half-width brick at the base. Closer inspection of one of these bricks revealed an extraordinary failure, the likes of which none of us had ever seen before. This brick is sheared completely in half, no doubt the result of some tremendous force. When or how this happened is unclear, but the visual reminder that masonry can and does fail in unseen places was a sobering one. Otherwise, the brick below grade appeared to be in sound condition, but Sarah's excavations in additional locations revealed brick walls that were not well tied together, and the unit revealing the base of the brick pier below the northernmost columns does not step out at all. Bennett's findings by documentation and observation were as follows. The center lines of the north and south arches in the basement do not line up with the center lines of the windows on the first and second floors. This is important because the loading from this wall is not applied symmetrically to the basement arches. These arches are worrisomely flat, and adding insult to injury, 3 of the 5 concrete beams supporting the first floor deck rest at the center line of the arch, its weakest point. Furthermore, the west end of the center beam and all of the weight it carried sat directly in the middle of the lintel over the doorway. The embedded reinforcing bars were found to be spaced too far apart from one another, and this was an easy thing to discover about them, as they were corroding so badly in some areas that they were completely exposed. This happened because of a phenomenon called oxide jacking. The iron reinforcing bars corrode and expand, exerting enough pressure on the surrounding concrete to blow it out in another process called spalling. This oxide jacking and spalling was taking place in several locations below the portico, and in some areas cracks could be seen in the brick masonry emanating from corroding reinforcing bars. Laser measurements showed that the first and second floors sloped away from the building, but not at steep enough angles to prevent water from pooling. This pooling water was able to perk down through stones and concrete, rotting joists and eroding mortar on the second floor, and contributing to the oxidation of the iron reinforcing bars in the basement. By measuring the rise and fall of one continuous mortar joint, Bennett's team determined that the north and south walls slope back toward the building, the west facade slopes toward both piers, and that north pier I keep returning to has dropped about 3 inches relative to the surrounding masonry. The south pier was found to have dropped 2 inches. With all this movement in the portico, it seemed inevitable that the columns would be out of plumb, and some of them are. Column 1 is displaced 1.2 degrees, and the southernmost column on the second floor is off 0.9 degrees. Below it, the brick pillar is separating outward from the main house and dropping. Now, For those of us whose heartbeats weren't quickened by talk of inches and tenths of degrees, Craig had one less section of findings to reveal, findings by computation. With regard to the soil stresses under the 2 masonry piers in the basement, under dead load alone, which is just the weight of the building, the stress was approximately 4 times what modern design loads would allow. An additional concern was the capacity of the brownstone lintels to bear the weight of groups on the 2nd floor portico. Bennett's computations revealed that the safe capacity for the lintels is 400 pounds per square inch, a number that we were potentially exceeding by 185 psi with each tour group that stepped onto the portico. Due to the tendency of stone to fail quickly and without warning, overloading the brownstone had the potential to result in sudden catastrophic failure. With that sobering information at hand, we immediately acted on Bennett's first recommendation to limit access to the 2nd floor portico until measures could be taken to ensure its safety. Additionally, Bennett recommended that the 1st floor portico not be used until loads had been removed from the crowns of the arches. He proposed doing this in the short term by erecting shoring posts in the basement below the portico and lifting the whole structure a fraction of an inch. Work progressed quickly to carry out the temporary shoring scheme in the basement. Sarah excavated the entire area below the portico in order to remove all cultural material that might be damaged during the project. By the end of the summer 2013, 10 shoring posts had been installed below the concrete beams, and here is how they worked. An adjustable shoring post was placed on a wooden block on top of a box filled with compressed sand. 2 such shoring posts were installed under each of the 5 concrete beams. Small rulers were installed in fixed locations around the basement, while larger metric rulers were suspended from the concrete beams. When the time came to apply pressure to the jacks, these suspended rulers would be compared to the fixed ones, enabling the engineering team to determine precisely when the structure had been lifted the desired amount. With the 2nd floor portico closed to visitors and the 1st floor firmly supported on its shoring posts, we found the conditions sufficiently stabilized to turn our focus to devising and implementing the most appropriate and sensitive rehabilitation plan possible. Ever mindful of the great significance of the building and the international attention such a project would attract, we decided to assemble a team of esteemed preservation professionals from various disciplines to guide the project. The team is pictured here. In October 2013, the group assembled for the first time for a portico forum. 2 intensive days spent together at Drayton Hall with 4 primary goals: to make the building happy, solve the load issues, devise a means of waterproofing the porches in order to prevent further deterioration, and above all, do no harm. As the group discussed these goals, 2 things became very clear. First, a thorough documentation campaign would be needed to understand and record the current conditions in and around the portico. Second, several types of analysis would need to be conducted to establish a timeline of construction, modification, and repair. It was agreed that a full year should be devoted to such documentation and research to ensure that the path to structural rehabilitation for the portico would be firmly rooted in a thorough understanding of its history and sound design that would address historic decays and protect historic fabric. On day 1 of the Portico Forum, the first item on the agenda was a discussion of the portico's history as best we understood it at the time, its significance, its decays, and various iterations of its design as seen in paintings, sketches, and photographs. You can see in these images that the entablature has been simplified. The brick pediment was modified first by the addition of an oculus in 1791, and later by the installation of shingles to replace damaged brick masonry. The balustrade has come and gone more than once in the intervening generations since the portico's construction, and of course there was the obvious addition of several tons of concrete added to repair and reinforce the structure in the early to mid-20th century. All of these changes are easy enough to see. Less simple was answering questions like, why did the original entablature go away? What kind of structure held the portico up before the concrete beams were installed? Are the brownstone lintels original to the house? And why are all of the second floor joists installed upside down and backwards? Pursuing answers to these and countless more questions was an essential next step in understanding the historic mechanisms of decay that threaten the preservation of the portico, gathering evidence of repairs, changes in building materials, and the evolution of the portico's design and appearance. Furthermore, there was an implicit understanding of two important facts. First, that we had an unprecedented opportunity to study an iconic structure, the likes of which exist nowhere else in the world. Second, that the loss of historic fabric and whatever stories it might be able to tell would be inevitable in the rehabilitation process. Thus, a thorough, well-documented examination was essential. We immediately developed a research plan designed to extract as much information as possible from the extant structure. The plan was organized around a list of questions about the portico's history and materials, and then subdivided into analysis that could be conducted on-site by Drayton Hall staff versus that which would need to be sent to an outside laboratory or otherwise studied by a contracted professional. As you might expect, some avenues of investigation were more fruitful than others. For instance, you see here that we asked, can the upper portico joists be dated? Well, in a word, no. We reached out to dendrochronologist Michael Worthington, who had previously been able to tell us that the timbers in the attic had been felled in the winter of 1747-48. He determines this by using a drill to extract samples from the wood in question. He then compares the tree rings visible in these wood samples to a database of samples that together create a chronology into which your sample, in theory, will neatly fit. Such was the case with the aforementioned attic samples, so we had every confidence that we would once again receive a hefty report full of murky climatological data that somehow, for Michael anyway, would point definitely to the month and year in which the trees were felled to make our joists. Sadly, that's not what happened. In a phone conversation with Michael, he explained to me that in the timbers he sampled from the portico, 10 in all, he found relief rings. These are very wide rings resulting from the overproduction of resin, possibly from extensive logging nearby, that make it virtually impossible to determine if rings are individuals or multiples. Without a stronger local chronology to compare these samples against, they were essentially undatable. Somewhat crestfallen, I asked him if he could tell me anything at all about the samples he took, and he replied that they were longleaf yellow pine, not cypress, as we had supposed. So dendrochronology didn't offer the answers that we'd hoped, but we had other avenues yet to pursue in our quest to better understand the second floor joists. Let's pull back for a moment and take a look at these joists to see why we were so interested in them in the first place. In this picture, you see the joists supporting the second floor of the portico. Typically hidden from view by a painted wooden ceiling, we exposed these joists when we removed the ceiling in 2013. We took the ceiling down to prevent water from pooling and further rotting the structure, and in so doing, uncovered all sorts of architectural wonders that would lead to several avenues of investigation, which I will get to later. The ceiling will be reinstalled as this project draws to a close. So back to the joists. We can tell a few things about them right off the bat. First, they're pretty old. Older, in fact, than a lot of wood at Drayton Hall. We know this because they're clearly hand-hewn. They bear the marks of the tool that roughly shaped them rather than the regular vertical or semicircular bands left by a pit saw or circular saw. Hand-hewn joists such as these are generally an indication that you're looking at a piece of wood installed in the early to mid-18th century. Elsewhere in the house, only the original framing members bear such tool marks. Later timbers are clearly cut with a circular saw. It may not strike you as very remarkable that the joists look to be early, but there was something very odd about where and how they were installed. On an exterior porch, it is important to create a slope away from the building to prevent rainwater from pooling and possibly entering the structure. One way to achieve such a slope is to taper the joists toward the exterior. These joists are tapered, but the skinny end is toward the inside of the building. As Craig found, there is a proper slope away from the interior of the portico, but it's definitely not achieved by the taper in the joists. Effectively, they were installed backwards. Furthermore, the joist ends that are inserted into the front wall of the house are notched on top. So they sit on a wooden bond timber like this. Typically, joists that are notched in this fashion are intended to rest on a timber like this. So ostensibly, they're installed upside down and backwards. And there's more. Immediately adjacent to each joist, where they are inserted into the front wall of the house, there is a rectangular section of brick that has clearly been patched. You can see that 1 or 2 brick bats have been inserted into the wall and patched with mortar that is visibly darker and of a different consistency than the original mortar. Taking all of this into consideration, it became clear to us that although these joists are old as Drayton Hall even, they are not original to the structure. In fact, the presence of original joist pockets immediately adjacent to the surviving joists suggests that they were installed with the originals in place, and then, presumably, the originals were removed and the joist pockets patched. So what does all this mean? Well, it could be that the original joists, exposed as they were to the elements, became rotten and in need of replacement. Assuming that the abandoned joist pockets were patched at the same time the new joists were installed, determining the date of the patch could help us understand when this might have happened. So how then to establish the date of the abandoned joist pockets? The obvious difference in the mortar seemed the most likely lead to pursue. At the beginning of our year-long research campaign, I identified 6 locations where I thought the mortar might hold important clues about the history of the portico. We took samples from these locations and mailed them to John Walsh at the Highbridge Materials Laboratory in New York. John conducted chemical and petrographic analysis of the 6 mortar samples. The chemical analysis uses an acid to digest the lime binder in mortar, leaving the aggregate behind. By measuring the sample weight before and after the acid dissolution process, you can determine the ratio of binder to aggregate, and then closely examine the aggregate itself. Petrographic analysis looks at the component parts of the sample under low magnification to observe the composition and character of aggregates, binders, and voids. All of this information considered together can offer clues about where and when a mortar might have been made. For instance, the mortar in the abandoned joist pockets was visibly different from the mortar used in the original construction of the house, in that it was yellowish tan in color rather than bright white, and lacked the large shell inclusions that can be found in the original mortar. John's mortar analysis confirmed that these mortars were of different periods. John's personal experience in analyzing numerous samples from Charleston buildings suggested to him that this mortar was probably made between 1800 and 1830. This conclusion confirmed a suspicion that was forming in our minds about when the joists might have been replaced, and how that work related to a much larger repair campaign by Charles Drayton in the 18-teens. So you'll remember that I began this story with Charles Drayton routing bees from the portico. In his diary entry on the bee battle, Drayton writes that he took of much honey, an important detail given that my first assumption, and possibly yours as well, was that he was dealing with carpenter bees. The fact that he was tangling with honeybees was something of a revelation, because if you've ever seen what honeybees can get up to in a building, you know that there's a good chance that Charles had to expose large sections of the portico to evict them. Recall that he discovers the bees in 1802, and then over the next 16 years, a cascade of repairs are made to the portico. Could it be that in evicting the bees, hidden portico decays were uncovered, launching a comprehensive portico overhaul not unlike the one we're carrying out today? I can't say for sure, but the evidence continues to point in that direction. Consider another architectural detail exposed by the dismantling of the portico ceiling. A layer of stucco covers the brownstone lintels above the columns on the first floor. On the exterior, the stucco is painted white, but on the interior, above the ceiling, the stucco is painted with a reddish lime wash. And we were excited to discover, incised lines above the two center columns painted gray to resemble a mortar joint. When might this have been done? Well, if you look at the sketch by Lewis Reeve Gibbs, circa 1845, you see joints in the same locations. What you cannot determine from the sketch is whether these are actual joints between two pieces of stone or faux joints painted on stucco. To get more insight, we reached out to esteemed paint analyst and conservator, Susan Buck. Susan analyzed the stucco on the interior and exterior of the portico and determined that there were 5 layers. A dull yellow pigmented lime wash similar to the first generation of paint found throughout the house, a deep red pigmented lime wash, another dull yellow pigmented lime wash, red lime wash with gray joints, and finally an opaque oil-bound gray paint dating to the 1870-1880 time period when profits from phosphate mining funded several updates to the main house. This was useful information for pinning down the latest the faux mortar joints could have been done, but left many questions unanswered about how the stucco might relate to Charles Drayton's repairs. I'm afraid I don't have anything definitive to offer you on that question, not yet anyway, but our research has turned up some other compelling evidence. On top of the brownstone lintels, there are 5 courses of brick. In the past, we've referred to this as the brick sandwich, since there is stone above and below the brick masonry. Thanks to John Walsh's mortar analysis, we know that these bricks were laid in mortar that dates to the same period as the mortar used in the abandoned joist pockets. And this makes sense because the brick sandwich is laid up in between the current joists instead of joists being chopped into an earlier structure. The stucco, with its 5 layers of lime wash and paint, is applied in some areas over this brick. So we know it must have been applied in the early to mid-19th century, but probably closer to the early 1800s, given the number of times new lime washes were applied. You can see the dates converging around the early 19th century alterations to the joists, stucco, and brick masonry. But what about the brownstone lintels? Are they original to the house? New evidence suggests that they are not. In 1818, Charles Drayton wrote in his diary that the masons had finished the erection of the architrave upon the columns. This seems like straightforward evidence that the current brownstone lintels were installed by Charles's masons in 1818, but how do we know that they weren't there before? After all, 3 years before, Charles's carpenter had 26 men take down one of the stone columns, which was subsequently replaced with another stone column. Perhaps he did the same with the architrave. Last month, we found the answer. Here is the lone section of fascia that survives from the original portico entablature. Susan Buck analyzed the surviving paint and found a layer of yellow ochre paint that matches the first generation of paint throughout the house. On the north wall of the portico, on the first floor, this piece of fascia was carefully removed during the rehabilitation project. Behind it, we discovered a section of brick masonry near the outer corner that was loose. We asked Ed Chappell to take a look, and what he found, while not surprising, represents a huge step forward in our understanding of the portico. After carefully removing the loose brick, we were able to see the pocket into which the current transverse stone lintel is inserted. The size of the pocket reveals that there was once a lintel that extended further into the wall by about 1.5 inches. In this image, you can see mortar that was once buttered up against the back of the lintel. And here, you can clearly see the impression of growth rings in the mortar. This is solid evidence that a wooden lintel was originally installed in this location. It is also clear that the depth of the lintel is changed such that the bottom of the lintel, which is currently several inches below the bottom of the original fascia, would have been even with the bottom of the fascia. This would allow the interior entablature to extend seamlessly all the way around the ceiling, much as the surviving entablature does on the second floor. Additional mortar analysis may help us relate the modification of the lintels to the other work carried out under the direction of Charles Drayton. In the basement below the portico, such analysis indicated an additional 19th century repair campaign, this one carried out towards the end of the 19th century, some 50 years after Charles's repairs. Take a look at these photographs looking at the first arch below the front wall of the house. The concrete beams you see are the ones that have supported the portico for as long as anyone can remember, but they are obviously not original to the house. So what held up the first floor deck before the concrete and rebar were installed? We suspected that there would have been wooden joists like those supporting the second floor portico, but we hoped to find evidence to support this theory, and we thought we saw some promising indications of where to start looking for such evidence in the concrete over the arches. Very carefully, we began removing the concrete in strategic locations, and what we found was a treasure trove of architectural details that helped illuminate the history of the portico and its decays. The process of removing the concrete and exposing the joist pockets began slowly and conservatively, but in the course of the demolition and rehabilitation, all of the concrete had to be removed and much of the brick masonry rebuilt. So what began as a few tantalizing glimpses at the early construction of the portico became an unprecedented opportunity to document and examine the structure. We learned that there were at least 2 generations of wooden joists supporting the first floor of the portico before the concrete was installed. We can infer that the joists succumbed to wood rot due to moisture infiltration until finally concrete was installed as an alternative solution. Exactly when the concrete was installed was difficult to determine. In an interview with C. Stuart Dawson and his son in 1973, the senior Mr. Dawson recalled that the porch fell in the 1930s and he replaced 90% of it. But when pressed for further details, he said, "They were all living then, Miss Bessie, Miss Charlie, and Mrs. Drayton, the 3 of them." This detail always troubled me, given that Miss Bessie, Eliza Gant Drayton, passed away in 1918, and Mrs. Drayton in 1926, both several years before the early 1930 time period that he had previously stated. We settled on a nebulous early 20th century time period for the installation of concrete and left it at that. That is, until we made a very lucky discovery that you may have seen featured in the Post and Courier over the summer. In June, contractors began sawing massive chunks of concrete out of the first floor that were then heaved over the railing into the bucket of a waiting tool cat. Sarah Clark and I happened to be walking by and stopped to take a look at the contents of the bucket, and Sarah spotted some trash embedded in the concrete. So we asked Jeff McNeely of Richard Marks Restorations if he could chisel it out for us to take a look. Crumpled up and firmly encased in the concrete, we found what seemed to be a wrapper of some kind with a red and white design. My first thought went to cigarette packaging, and I began scouring the internet for logos that looked right. But the more I turned the wrapper this way and that, I realized there was something very familiar about it. A logo I knew and saw often, and it wasn't for cigarettes. Another quick internet search, and I had it. Here are all of the logos used by the National Biscuit Company, Nabisco, between 1900 and today. You can just make out the D in UNITA at the bottom of the wrapper, solid evidence that this was a wrapper used between 1923 and 1941. So it seems the 1930s date that Mr. Dawson recalled was a good fit after all. By the end of 2014, we felt we had a much firmer grasp of the history of the portico and that we had enough information to make informed decisions about the path the rehabilitation project should take. As an aside, I'd like to briefly discuss my use of the term rehabilitation. The Secretary of the Interior defines rehabilitation as the act or process of making possible a compatible use for a property through repair alterations, and additions while preserving those portions or features which convey its historical, cultural, or architectural values. Rehabilitation describes an approach that is less conservative than our usual tack of preserving the building, but does not go so far as to single out a particular period that a structure should be tied to, as is done with restoration projects. In order to make the portico safe for the demands we place on it and protect it from further decay, we had to make extensive changes, but we still retained and took steps to protect as much historic fabric as possible. At the second Portico Forum in October 2014, the group considered the findings from the 12-month research campaign, discussing the pros and cons of various designs ranging from concrete and aluminum to old-fashioned wood and stone. In theory, everyone favored a return to traditional building materials, but worried that in practice, a system that included wood joists with stone masonry above would be doomed to fail, just as it had done historically. We talked through one scenario after another, asking the same questions. Is it reversible? Is it maintainable? Is it compatible with surrounding historic materials? Will our modern repair be recognizable but inoffensive? Ultimately, a design began to take shape that satisfied all of our criteria, and here is how it works. 19 old-growth wood joists were cut from salvaged pine timbers found in Richmond, Virginia. They are placed in the historic joist pockets we uncovered in the basement with an important modification. To protect the surviving architectural evidence at the back of the joist pockets and to prevent the wooden joist ends from rotting in place, copper boots were fabricated to go in each joist pocket, acting as a sleeve for the joist ends. Additionally, the joist ends were soaked in copper naphthenate to further protect them from deterioration. Craig Bennett's design avoided using the joist pockets over the weaker arches by employing large header beams in front of the arches. This had the added benefit of leaving several of the joist pockets completely untouched by our repairs. On top of the joists, there are sleepers made of modern treated lumber. On top of that is a deck made of peel and stick ice and water shield. 6 copper drains were installed on top of this ice and water shield to catch any water not carried off by the next few layers, which included a drainage mat, a mortar bed, another drainage mat, mortar again, and finally stone. So, in theory, water would have to pool on the deck, perk down through the stone floor, through 2 mortar beds, past 2 drainage mats, and somehow avoid the copper drains and the weep holes to get to the wood joist below. It seems improbable, but we aren't kidding ourselves. The wood will rot eventually. That's what it does. So our hope is that by installing it the way we did, with the ends in copper boots and attached with joist hangers rather than being mortised and tenon together, when the time does come to replace a joist, it will be reasonably simple to accomplish. The stone floor should look much as it did when the project began. All of the red sandstone pavers are original, although some had to be repaired before they could be reinstalled, and others were brought up from the basement. The limestone didn't fare quite as well. About 3/4 of it is new, but we ordered it from the same Portland quarry in England where the originals were sourced. If you're looking for them, you'll find most of the original limestone pavers grouped near the center of the portico. What you don't see are the cleverly hidden tie rods that prevent various sections of the portico from moving away from the house. Here's a side view of one of the tie rods. A temporary skid was designed to hold the core drill that bored a 1.5-inch hole about 17 feet through solid masonry and hit a target about the size of a $50. On this end, you see a welded plate hidden behind the first course of brick. On the opposite side, you can see the patcher's plate and nut that secure the threaded rod to the house. This design allows us to periodically put a wrench on the nut to make sure the rod remains in tension. A similar rod runs the length of the portico below the columns and is likewise accessible by removing one brick on each of the two pillars. At the second floor level, two threaded rods run through the ceiling and are held by patchwork plates on the exterior of the stone lintels. These plates will be encased in stucco on the exterior of the building. On the interior, they are accessed by taking up a section of flooring in the upper grade hall, where, again, we'll be able to use a wrench to periodically tighten the nuts on the threaded rods. On the second floor, we chose to leave the concrete deck in place for two reasons. First, it's doing no harm, and second, whatever we replaced it with would be completely conjectural. Instead, we opted to float a system above it to prevent further water intrusion into the structure. A layer of hardy plank has been installed and coated with a roofing membrane that mimics the look of traditional canvas deck covering. Again, it satisfies our criteria of being reversible, compatible, and recognizable without being offensively so. In the course of this project, we discovered a part of the building we never knew existed. I'm going to run that by you again. We discovered a part of the building we never knew existed. Now, if this sounds like the plot to the postmodern horror novel House of Leaves, in which a young family discovers that the inside of their house is larger than the outside, it's not. The undiscovered territory was in an inaccessible part of the building that we had to inspect for structural integrity. You'll recall that we removed the 5 concrete beams and concrete deck of the first floor. Some of this concrete was poured beneath columns 2 and 3, in what we would come to realize must have been a really risky maneuver. Removing this concrete would undermine the column's support, and thus a means of keeping them upright and distributing their load had to be devised before the concrete could be removed. Craig Bennett and George Fisher devised a system of steel collars that would grab the 2 center columns and lift them each a fraction of an inch while carrying their load to the masonry wall below. For this to be done safely, we needed to be sure that the masonry wall below was substantial enough to hold up to such stress. The wall is hidden on the exterior by the stairs leading up to the portico, and on the interior by a stucco coating. To assess its condition, we identified a section of damaged stucco close to the floor on the north side of the basement. Here, we removed 1 brick and drilled a 3-inch diameter hole all the way through the wall. By coring through the wall this way, we were able to determine that it was solid masonry, well suited to the task of carrying the weight of the columns and steel. The surprise came when the core drill punched through the other side of the wall into open air. Craig attached a small camera to a long piece of wood and carefully fed it through the hole into the cavity on the other side of the wall. When he withdrew the camera, we all huddled around to watch the video play back on the tiny screen. As the camera slowly panned around the space, one man, who I will not name, jumped excitedly up and down, and I pulled out my phone. Here's what we saw: a vaulted space below the lower deck of the first floor portico. In one wall, a bricked-in hole seems to be a passage used by the men who built the stairs. If you pause the video, you can see trowel marks in the mortar on the inside of the vault. Presumably, they shimmied out the top of the vault before laying the final bricks at the top of the arch. Fallen brick centering lays in a heap in the middle of the space. These pockets in the brick seem to indicate that wooden timbers held the semicircular brick support until they rotted and the brick came crashing down. We made further discoveries below the stairs, which I will save for another day. So for now, let's go back to the column lift. Columns 2 and 3 were wrapped in a rubbery material called EPDM, and then surrounded with vertical oak staves before being clamped with the steel collars. The EPDM and wood staves helped to protect the columns from the crushing force of the steel. On the day of the lift, we waited until the site was clear of visitors and then began the slow and methodical process of lifting them. A hand pump jack applying pressure around 600 psi was the only equipment needed to lift the 40,000-pound load. Fresh plaster telltales on the column bases were our canary in the coal mine, so to speak. We all watched carefully for a crack to form in the plaster. As soon as a crack opened up at the base of the column, lifting stopped, and we had what we needed. When all was said and done, one column had been lifted 1/50th of an inch, or the thickness of 5 pieces of printer paper. The other column was lifted 1/125th of an inch, or 2 pieces of printer paper. The columns remained in this position for a few days while workers safely removed the concrete below the columns, rebuilding with brick and wood. Then, as smoothly and quietly as they were picked up, the pressure on the jacks was released and the 2 columns were set back down. What an amazing feat of engineering to pick up so much weight in place with no impact whatsoever on the surrounding building materials. It was a sight to behold. If the weather continues to be as favorable as it has been this week and temperatures remain above freezing, then we will close the book on this project in about 2 weeks' time. I spoke with Craig Bennett yesterday and shared with him that in the proverbial can't see the forest for the trees sense, my preparation for tonight's talk has been a welcome reminder that this portico project has been an impressive feat of engineering, preservation, and interpretation. We picked up part of the portico in situ and put it back down with no adverse effects. We completely rebuilt the first floor deck, removed several tons of concrete, and did it while protecting and reinstalling a significant proportion of historic fabric. We generated videos, professional publications, and newspaper articles weekly. And as Craig stated when I asked him about his favorite part of the project, we did all of these things and everything worked beautifully. The first day of spring is 32 days away. Hooray. It's a beautiful time to visit Drayton Hall, and I hope all of you will come out to the site. Take a house tour, and when you're standing on the portico for the first time in 3 years, take a moment to reflect on what you've heard here tonight. Think about all of the careful planning, the discoveries, the design, and craftsmanship that went into this project. It's the caliber of work that we're all committed to at the Drayton Hall Preservation Trust. That's why I'm proud to do what I do, and I hope it reaffirms your decision to support our work by being friends of Drayton Hall. The paradox of our preservation philosophy is that there's always more work to be done to maintain the house in its current state. So I can assure you that there is more groundbreaking work and exciting discoveries on the horizon. Thank you.
All right. Thanks to Trish, one, for her presentation, but the second for managing this project, which has been a feat of engineering, dendrochronology, snack wrappers. The list goes on and on. It's very representative, I think, of the multidisciplinary work, though, that goes into everything that we do at Drayton Hall. It's not just architecture, it's not just archaeology, it's multidisciplinary research, and we all cross-pollinate each other's work. So thank you, Trish. Are there any questions?
First, I just want to thank you for a really thorough investigation and presentation. But one thing you didn't talk about, and I've always wondered how odd it is, the pediments, the shingles. Is there any plan to restore the pediment to an earlier version?
Digitally, yes.
Really? Those shingles just seem so odd.
I know. Those date to that same 1870, 1880 time period when
Really?
natural flux coming from phosphate mining, but it's not, doesn't really fit in with our preservation philosophy. So digitally, I will.
Any others?
I want to know what that little ring was. You teased us.
I mean, I think it's probably just a means of building the stairs so that wall kind of supports the structure. Like to think it's more exciting.
Yeah.
Maybe it's that simple.
We didn't see any silver or anything in there, but having said that, I mean, Trish and the rest of the staff, their job is never done. The project at hand has been to really stabilize and conserve the portico, and there's always going to be more questions. So Sarah, you want to get in there, right? Yeah. So we'll keep digging on it.
Is there any chance that some of the damage was done by the earthquake?
Absolutely.
I mean, do you know what might have been done by the earthquake? And, I mean, it's hard to narrow down things and say this might have been the earthquake. And this is, I mean, they're still discovering problems downtown that were never quite fixed.
Yeah, I think it's very likely that that one brick that was sheared in half,
That would be.
yeah, it's very likely that happened in Europe.
Carter, this is amazing work that Tricia, you and Carter and the whole team have done in 5 years. And how much money did all of this cost? Because I think that's, you don't do this on a shoestring.
Well, it's it's the best portico and it's the most expensive portico. We'll leave it at that. Excluding staff time, which has carried a lot of the research and the investigation, and hats off to Trish and Sarah and Cameron and everybody else at Drayton Hall, staff-wise, that's been a part of chiseling and hammering and removing ceiling and all the rest. That's a huge sum. Outside of that, it's at least $750,000. So we're looking at it. It's a 7-figure project, which is a lot of money, but as Trish mentioned, this is the best portico. It's the first of its kind in the world, and it's representative of our national and South Carolinian history. So money well spent. And thanks to everybody who has supported it.
Where will the header beam be seen? Is it visible when you walk through the building?
You can see it from below, in the basement you can see. So all of those joists are exposed below, so if you tour the basement, you'll see all of that structure.
It's a pretty good view.
It looks great, and invite everybody to Drayton Hall in the near future to stand on the portico. So, thank you all. Hearing no other questions, thank everybody for coming tonight. Reminder, the second installment of our 2016 speaker series takes place next month. Jonathan Holloway from Yale will be coming down and talking about curating the Black Atlantic. So sure to be a great lecture by Jonathan. Hope to see you all there. Thanks so much.